fossil-based supply chains have their own negative externalities aside from their emissions profile. These can be incredibly destabilizing just with small interruptions in supply. The world runs on about 100 million barrels a day of crude oil, and that crude oil is often located in politically volatile regions. Russia, the Middle East, these are areas where trade has been restricted over the last couple of years and perhaps increasingly over the next 10. We're seeing the energy sovereignty conversation really start to spool up in the United States, in Europe. We want our own ability to produce hydrocarbon fuels, hopefully decoupled from the necessity for large amounts of crude feedstocks. And so this is a new segment of the conversation that's going to become increasingly impactful and command increasing political risk price premiums over the course of the next ensuing decades. So we see synthetic fuel as a critical part of the conversation. Local energy production, local fuel production, decoupled from the need for politically volatile crude oil feedstocks.
Welcome to the Blue Ocean Solutions podcast, where we dive into real conversations with business owners, innovators, and industry leaders reshaping the future of clean tech, construction, and the renewable energy sectors. I'm Kreel Hutchinson, your host. Our guest today is Dan Sutton, the co-founder and CEO of Syntholene Energy based out of the Chicago area. Today, we're going to discuss his pioneer work in creating high-performance, low-cost, and carbon-neutral synthetic fuels that are set to revolutionize the aviation industry and decouple us from volatile fossil fuel markets. If you're a leader in clean tech, renewable energy, or the aviation sector, you will love this show because it unveils how groundbreaking innovation can achieve both environmental sustainability and economic competitiveness. It's an example of how market forces can drive a cleaner, more efficient future for global energy. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thanks so much for your time, Kreel. Really appreciate this opportunity to share our story with you and your audience.
I was really excited to have you on the show because what we're going to talk about is really like a game-changing technology that could make a massive impact both on the global and the macro level. So for people who are unfamiliar with you, your company, and the work that you guys do, why don't you introduce yourself?
Really appreciate it. My name is Dan Sutton. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders of Syntholene Energy Corp. Syntholene is in the business of producing specialty fuels. We start with a specialty grade of aviation fuel. It reaches a really high performance spec. It also happens to be carbon neutral, which allows us to address sustainable aviation fuel markets for airlines and other consumers that are actively trying to reduce their emissions footprint, and it is drop-in substitutable. We make the same fuels that airlines are consuming from fossil-based inputs, but we do it in a way that leverages the technology of fuel synthesis. This has been around a long time. We've known how to synthesize hydrocarbon fuels from their constituent parts, hydrogen and carbon. It's just never been both clean and economic. And we're really lucky that a few key pieces of technology have recently reached a degree of industrial maturity that companies like Syntholene can now integrate those technologies and produce this fuel at increasing cost competition with fossil fuels. It's really hard to overstate the impact that carbon-neutral synthetic fuels are going to make on our liquid fuel landscape over the course of well within our lifetimes. And Syntholene really hopes to drive that adoption curve faster so that we can see those impacts over the next 5 years.
I love it. There's so much to dive into because that's such a great broad opening of kind of like a high level. Before we get into the details, I know probably from our audience, they're like, wait, what? Well, like, how do you do that? Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about you and your company. So give us a little bit, what have you guys been up to the last few years? How have you reached this point? You know, when was the inception of the company? Who's involved? How big you are? Give us a little bit of the background.
So I started my career personally working in small modular nuclear reactors in my early 20s. I went on to build a few different businesses, and I'm really privileged that I've actually sat in the CEO founder chair for 15 years. So despite my youthful demeanor, I actually have quite a lot of seasoned experience, and I've built some incredible things with some incredible teams. But that company that I started my work with as I left studying economics and finance at university and moved into the workforce, they went on to some exceptional success. That company was called Thorium One, and it evolved into a company called Terrestrial Energy. Terrestrial Energy is co-founded by my colleague and partner, Cannon Bryan. He's an individual who's actually built 3 different billion-dollar plus companies in advanced energy systems, energy sovereignty. He worked in the uranium sector. He worked in the niobium and rare earth sector. And most recently, he built this company called Terrestrial Energy, which designs advanced high temperature modular nuclear reactors from low enriched uranium sources. And they actually just went public on the NASDAQ in October of 2025. So this company is one of the leaders now in small modular reactors, not just for the generation of electricity, but on an often overlooked subset of the energy sector, which is also the production of industrial heat. Industrial heat is about $7 trillion a year worth of demand. It's how we make all of our steel, cement. We run chemical synthesis processes, heavy manufacturing, and today it is about 99% fossil fired. If you're going to run these systems and operations, electrification is just not really a thermodynamically efficient way to operate those systems. And at least today, it is substantially economically uncompetitive. So what do we use? Generally coal, sometimes natural gas, very occasionally oil. But those fossil inputs are critical to the high temperature operations of those industrial process bases. So the advent of using high temperature nuclear, a known low emission source to replace some of these fossil inputs, sent the founders of Terrestrial Energy on this crazy exploratory mission. They looked at all these different systems, cement manufacturer, steel manufacturer, and they ranked them by the opportunity, not just to reduce emissions based on those operations, but also what is going to be the most economically compelling things we can do with low emissions, low cost industrial heat from small modular reactors. And right at the top ranked fuel synthesis, a really well understood process. It goes back a history of almost 120 years, but generally it's relied on inputs such as coal and natural gas to take the chemical constituents of hydrogen through steam methane reforming and carbon and synthesize them together, usually with reactors like the Fischer-Tropsch reactor, or more recently, the methanol to jet reactors. And through that research, Cannon and our other co-founder, chief engineer John Kutch, realized that this opportunity was not just massively reducing emissions potential, but also could be economically competitive and ultimately lower costs than fossil fuels. All of this work kind of took place between sort of the early 20s and then the early 20s, and they went on to demonstrate this process in collaboration with the Idaho National Lab by simulating nuclear process heat into a fuel synthesis system and a hydrogen production system. And sure enough, they demonstrated that this pathway works. It has sufficient efficiencies to imagine eventual cost competitiveness with fossil fuels, and all of this information was published in the public domain. They put their research out. People who are viewing this podcast can go look it up. Idaho National Lab, Solid Oxide Electrolyzer Cell Process Lab, or SOEC. And the day of imagining these clean fuels, clean synthetic fuels, cost competitively with fossil fuels has officially arrived.
That's fantastic. It kind of allows my audience to see the backstory and the foundation of how we've gotten to this place where obviously you guys have decades of experience inside this industry, both in the CEO side of things and building companies, but also on the research side of things and finding what is viable within the marketplace. So as we get a little bit deeper into, what you guys do here, one of the questions I had was like, on our initial pre-podcast call, and I'll ask it here, is just like, well, what is this stuff made of? Like, if it's not fossil fuels, what is it? For the layman who may be watching this, can you break that down?
It's so fascinating. And I mean, for the uninitiated, tantamount to alchemy. What are hydrocarbon fuels made of? In historic cases, we've refined down from fossil-based feedstocks, crude oil, or more recently, we've also used other feedstocks, from biofuels, things like corn oil, soybean oil, cellulose, and other crude constituents that also require a refining process. But if we go down to first principles, we understand that hydrocarbon fuels are simply chained combinations of hydrogen through the double bonds of carbon. And generally, the longer the chain that you get, the different energy density characteristics and different fuel applications you can find. These span a bunch of different hydrocarbon offerings, all the way from very short chains that create sort of waxes and greases and bunker oil and heavy oils, all the way through to very long chains, things like CH12 to CH16, which we really like. That's how you find your kerosene fraction, all the way up to light gases like naphtha, white gas, ethylenes for plastic, any product that we have historically derived from fossil-based crude feedstocks, we can actually synthesize those chains, and all we need are hydrogen and carbon. So where do we get those hydrogen and carbon molecules? The core feedstocks for Syntholene's imagined synthetic fuel industrial scale production system are as simple as water and energy. When we use energy through an advanced electrolysis process, we can actually crack hydrogen from the water molecule. H2O, we separate the O's, we take the H2, and that H2 is the essential first feedstock that we need to then combine with carbon through a fuel synthesis reactor, carbon that we can also pull out of water, out of seawater, out of the atmosphere. We can get it from point source emitters like industrial emitters. We can get it biogenically from places like pulp and paper mills. So lots of different sources of carbon that we're actually actively trying to capture across many different economies and industries around the world. And then we synthesize those two together to formulate the exact chains that we're looking for. And the key contributing technologies, the electrolysis systems and the fuel synthesis systems, have each gone through some pretty incredible step change advances just over the last few years. So these systems have increased their efficiencies, they've increased their durabilities, they've really reached the industrial and technological maturity that we can imagine integrating them at large industrial scale. And it's the advent of that industrial maturity that allows companies like Syntholene to imagine how we tie those together and make meaningful substitution effect cost competitively with fossil fuels.
Amazing. Thank you so much for explaining that. Even for someone like myself who's not well trained in that, that makes sense to me. I kind of understand the story or the diagram that you just presented there. So I appreciate that. What are some of the most influential trends you have seen that are influencing your business and the industry right now that you guys are being able to like ride the back of, or that are headwinds for you?
So I think the advent of the kinds of products that we make really stems from this e-fuel trend. For your customers or audience that haven't heard of e-fuels, it's sort of the short form of how we talk about synthetic fuels. And one of the core features for encouraging consumption, encouraging scaled production of these e-fuels has been their ability to approach carbon neutrality. Because we're using captured carbon, this is an amazing opportunity to reduce the pretty drastic emissions profiles that come from places that are called hard to abate sectors. A lot of those industrial operations that I spoke about before, but also things like marine shipping transport and aviation. We can't imagine, with our current understanding of physics, an ability to make an electric jet turbine that would power a plane fast enough to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a matter of hours. And so we're going to need to continue to use hydrocarbon fuels to power jet aviation in our current understanding of how those systems work. And so the advent of these e-fuels as drop-in substitutes, replaceable substitutes that work in existing turbines, as well as motors and engines and all kinds of other tools that utilize hydrocarbon inputs today, that has become a key pathway for decarbonizing and reducing the emissions profile from aviation generally. Now, that's gotten really exciting. There's a bunch of amazing policy measures and different governments around different regions that are encouraging the production of e-fuels and other types of emissions reducing fuels for the aviation industry. But I think something that we've picked up on as recently as just the last few weeks is that fossil-based supply chains have their own negative externalities aside from their emissions profile. These can be incredibly destabilizing just with small interruptions in supply. The world runs on about 100 million barrels a day of crude oil, and that crude oil is often located in politically volatile regions. Russia, the Middle East, these are areas where trade has been restricted over the last couple of years and perhaps increasingly over the next 10. And so we're seeing the energy sovereignty conversation really start to spool up in the United States, in Europe. We want our own ability to produce hydrocarbon fuels, hopefully decoupled from the necessity for large amounts of crude feedstocks. And so this is a new segment of the conversation that's going to become increasingly impactful and command increasing political risk price premiums over the course of the next ensuing decades. So we see synthetic fuel as a critical part of the conversation in getting local energy production, local fuel production decoupled from the need for politically volatile crude oil feedstocks.
I completely agree with you. You make some very valid points that will probably continue to gain speed and traction over the coming months and years. Where are you guys at in the process? Because obviously, this endeavor that you're talking about is a major dis- disruption technology inside a very established energy marketplace. So, where are you at in taking Syntholene Energy from concept to perhaps pilot to full scale market commercialization and industrialization? Can you share us what's the journey look like?
We, I would say, are right on the cusp of getting to the operational proof points that demonstrate that this type of fuel synthesis system can operate. It can operate efficiently. It can operate in a scalable manner, and it's ready for industrial scale investment and scaling up production to make a meaningful impact. More specifically, our operations have been demonstrated at a prototype scale. This was done substantially alongside the Idaho National Lab, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and one of my co-founders, our chief engineer, John Kutch, was lucky to contribute to that work in the context of nuclear process heat all the way into hydrogen production as a feedstock for synthetic fuel production. Now, lab scale prototypes are amazing, but what most of the industrial scale investors who make meaningful investments in everything from oil and gas refineries to energy infrastructure, and ultimately will hopefully make investments into increasing e-fuels production infrastructure if those e-fuels can demonstrate cost competitiveness and economic efficiency. What they really look for is demonstration facility infrastructure that's integrated to real world energy assets. Now, this posed a problem for Syntholene because nuclear reactors are not exactly off-the-shelf catalog items. You can't go out and buy a small modular reactor today and just put it down anywhere you want. And so we had to go a bit further, and that led us to a deep interest in geothermal energy. Geothermal provides the heat and pressure character that we need to be able to operate these high temperature fuel synthesis operations. And it does so in a very similar characteristic to how you would get industrial process heat from a nuclear reactor. So our origins are very much in the small modular reactor world, but we came to understand that there were geothermal resources, not everywhere, but specific categories of geothermal resources that would provide enough heat, generally between 100 and 200 degrees Celsius in the form of geothermal enthalpic steam, and also be able to spin turbines to generate base load, consistently available, low intermittency electricity that is suitable and ultimately ideal for industrial scale operations where we want as close to 99% uptime as we can get. So the great news is that Syntholene Energy is actively in construction on the world's first thermally integrated SOEC demonstration facility. We've got a fantastically geothermally active site in Iceland, and we are in construction now. We're hoping to have this demonstration facility operational by the end of the year in 2026. Relative to the histories of my team, designing nuclear reactors, building other kinds of chemical synthesis infrastructure, and managing a diversity of pretty interesting complex construction projects in the energy markets, this is a relatively simple deployment for us. And so we're really ambitious that we're going to be able to say sooner rather than later, this isn't just a lab-based hypothesis. This is a real demonstration integrated to a real-world energy asset. And that is the key unlocking mechanism that we'll be able to show to larger scale industrial investors, a diversity of governments that want to be sponsoring and making investments in this kind of infrastructure. And if we can get that online before the end of the year in 2026, we're going to be able to show the world that this is not just a future dream, that these results are real, and that this is ready for industrial scale today.
Dan, your work with Syntholene Energy is truly groundbreaking. Can you share how you plan to bridge the gap between this cutting edge technology and broader market adoption, especially when it comes to educating potential partners and customers about the economic advantages of your e-fuels?
Well, there is only one way to do that in a commodity market, even if it is a specialty commodity market, even if our specialty commodity offering might have some really cool solutions to some of the negative externalities associated with fossil fuels, lower emissions profile. We spoke about decoupling from fossil feedstocks and the ensuing risk premiums or other types of premiums that are associated with that. All that stuff sounds great. But at the end of the day, I reflect on the brand promise of Standard Oil, going all the way back, the inventors of kerosene or the discoverers of kerosene, and what they offered to their fuel customers was quite simply the highest quality fuel at the lowest possible price. It doesn't really matter where our fuel comes from, whether it's fossil feedstocks, corn oil feedstocks, waste to energy, all that stuff. Customers in the aviation industry, marine shipping industry, gasoline customers, diesel customers over time, they want to know, is this fuel high quality? Is it going to meet my performance specs, or in some cases in the synthetic context, exceed my performance specs? And can I get it cost competitively? Now, the great news is that synthetic fuel is widely understood to passively create higher performance outcomes than fossil or biofuels. This is because we are not refining down from feedstocks that leave the fuels with entrained adulterants, things like copper, cadmium, and lead, which are deleterious emissions. You wouldn't want to inhale them if you could avoid it, but they also impede the performance of engines, motors, and turbines. So they're less than ideal from an environmental perspective, but also less than ideal from an operational perspective. Synthetic fuel, because it designs the molecule and just produces the exacting long chain hydrocarbon molecule that we're looking to sell to aviation customers in our first instance, we get molecular purity passively. This means higher performance outcomes, oftentimes sort of high single digit energy density gains. And that is all just part of the process. We don't add copper, cadmium, or lead into it. And so that fuel purity, fuel spec is something that we can offer. We don't have to make sacrifices on performance to get this carbon neutral fuel. Now, the real key here is unit economics. There are other teams and labs and companies that have pursued the ability to make low emissions synthetic fuels before, but historically that's been hamstrung to exceptionally high prices, generally using intermittent power sources like wind and solar, low efficiency, low temperature electrolysis processes, many of which are sort of decades old. That doesn't produce an economic outcome where we can even envision a scaled pathway to be able to get to cost competition with fossil fuels. So that's the critical nature of our demonstration facility. If we can show that this pathway exists and show that we can reach that cost parity and feasibly below the cost of fossil fuels at sufficient industrial scale, that is going to be a revolutionary change in how we consume hydrocarbon fuels today. And I believe to the core of my being that we will definitely see widespread synthetic fuel adoption, whether it be produced by Syntholene or someone else, well within our lifetimes. And it's Syntholene's goal to accelerate that timeline to within the next 5 years.
Fantastic. So if I could summarize that, the way to educate the marketplace is to create a better and cheaper product that will draw the attention it's required.
That's absolutely right. Energy markets, commodity markets, they all obey the same self-interested laws of economics. And if we give our customers a self-interested choice to pick this carbon neutral synthetic fuel, then the outcomes, the positive outcomes of fixing those emissions externalities will proliferate without us needing to leverage deep policy measures or everlasting subsidy or everlasting mandates. We can use those policy options as a bridge to self-interested economic choice. And by the way, the market, it never loses. Market dynamics are always going to push people towards self-interest. And we really hope that we can deliver that for synthetic fuels.
With such a lean and AI native team, how do you envision scaling your outreach and engagement efforts to secure the necessary takeoff agreements and strategic partnerships needed for industrial scale production?
Well, it's definitely carefully and hearts and minds one at a time. We only get one chance to make a first impression. And while so many of our prospective customers have been motivated and excited by the lab based data, we want to really be able to go to potential customers and say, hey, here is proof positive from demonstration facility results, from testing of the outputs, from purity outcomes, and give them a chance to say, wow, I didn't know that we were already here. We sort of want to shock them and excite them with knowledge that isn't just a faraway dream, but rather something that's been demonstrated practically. And so we've been very sensitive to what kind of partnerships we pursue and when we pursue them. Now, we're lucky that customers come in a few different forms. Airlines are obviously our sort of obvious choice, the lowest hanging fruit. There's also been a lot of interest from the marine shipping industry. Then we have other kinds of potential customers like airline groups and oil and gas companies. Oil and gas companies, in our experience, and we've talked to many of them, they're aware of this technology, they're aware of its sort of lab scale proof points, but they really want to see those demonstration results attached to a real world energy asset. So I'm privileged in that I don't really need hundreds and hundreds of customers. I wouldn't be able to supply those immediately anyway. And so we get to be quite selective with the groups that we're choosing. Even a small airline expression of interest, such as the one that we've secured with Iceland Air, an indication of volumes and sort of delivery schedule of when they might want the fuel, those contracts can grow into the many hundreds of millions or billions of dollars just with one small customer. So it could be that Syntholene has one or two or five customers as we launch our first production footprint, but we're not going to need tens or 20s or hundreds. Now, I will say that the insights that we can gain about our customer using modern search tools, including AI, I want to know everything I can before I get into those conversations so that I can be prepared to discuss the real pain points that they're experiencing and how synthetic fuels such as Syntholenes might be a solution to those pain points. And so we definitely use a lot of market intelligence tools, a lot of insights, and just talk to as many people as we can about what are the problems that you're facing today, and then what are the problems that you anticipate 5 years from now.
Fantastic. The size that you guys are at, are you looking for investors to be part of the team to help bring this to marketplace to expedite this process? Or are you well funded as of right now, and that's not necessarily a concern?
We're well funded with exceptional partners that can see us through multiple different funding rounds at different proof points and different sort of scales of evolution of the company. But we are always in the market for aligned, long-term thinking, high-quality investors. Those investors have grown from sort of seed stage. We have a lot of founder resources, angel investors earlier in our history, and friends and family towards more institutional type investors and industrial scale-up type of investors. And so we're really lucky to have a diverse mix. But there's no doubt in my mind that once companies like Syntholene prove that we can produce this fuel cost competitively at a high quality in a drop-in substitutable manner, we're going to need many, many billions of dollars worth of scale-up investing. And there's only a handful of groups in the world that can see things like oil refineries or nuclear power plants or wind farms into industrial scale operation. Oftentimes, that's a combination of private resources, government resources, policy entrenched resources. And so we're always in the market for high quality investors. And I make it my business to talk to lots of them every week.
Fantastic. So There's obviously a lot of things going well for you guys, and there's good momentum, especially towards all the activity that you have going on in Iceland in 2026. What are some of the major bottlenecks or challenges, both potentially on the industrial side or maybe even just in the growth inside the company? What are some of those challenges that you're experiencing?
Well, first and foremost, this sounds way too good to be true. Synthetic fuel that's carbon neutral, that's higher performance at lower cost. Why hasn't anyone else done this? Why aren't large oil and gas companies do this? Reasonable skepticism that we run into all the time, which makes a ton of sense. But this sounds too good to be true is probably what was also said about the steam engine, about the tractor, about motor vehicles replacing horses and carriages. So we are lucky that we get to share this good news that we are at this time in history where the technological subcomponents of our process do exist with industrially mature track records, and we can integrate them efficiently. But as we go from demonstration scale to first commercial scale to increasing industrial scale, there is no doubt that we are going to need to secure supply chains, feedstocks, operational insight. There is a sort of a ton of hills left to climb, and we must climb them one at a time and in the right order. We can't go solve supply chain issues that we're not going to face for 5 years today. And so I think investors and customers have to buy in to a risk profile associated with how do you go through what's often called the valley of death, not just prototype in a lab, then demonstration facility, then industrial scale up, and even achieving shovel readiness for a small scale commercial footprint that requires community engagement, environmental permitting, supply chain readiness, feedstocks, all of these various things that many, many companies try and fail to achieve all the time. Now, what I will say is I'm really lucky to have partners, co-founders, and operators that have bridged those gaps into industrial scale infrastructure operations before, and some of which they've done that with the best industrial, chemical synthesis companies or oil and gas companies in the world. And so we do have a bit of experience on how we're going to cross those bridges when we come to them, but that risk is non-trivial. And anybody who's looking for exposure in the future of the e-fuels business, which is growing really rapidly today and is just on the cusp of an economic competitiveness message, which will see a whole lot more resources flow into the sector, they need to be conscious that not all energy assets, not all fuel synthesis infrastructure is created equal, and really important to get the technology stack right so that it's durable and ready for that industrial workload.
You mentioned messaging, and considering the long-term vision and massively substituting fossil fuels, how important is it for a Syntholene Energy to build a robust and scalable marketing and public relations strategy from this early stage?
I think increasingly important. I think the world is not generally aware of the opportunity in e-fuels and synthetic fuels. Certainly, most of the people I speak to aren't aware that the technology that allows cost competition with fossil fuels does exist today. It has been demonstrated at a lab scale. And so getting this great message out that the future of hydrocarbon fuels doesn't necessarily need to be attached to crude fossil feedstocks and the negative externalities that are sort of diversifying on the daily basis. Those messages need to be couched well. They need to be effectively articulated to people without a technical background. Even just explaining what we do and how we got here is inherently a bit of a complex message. And so we are definitely looking for thought partners, for leaders, for advocates, third-party validation from large-scale EPC firms and subject matter experts. All of these things we're working on right now to be able to get this into the living rooms and the dinner tables of your average European or American or Canadian, to be able to say, hey, I read this really cool thing. It sounds like there's a new production pathway that we can envision the consumption of hydrocarbons in a clean way, in a cost-efficient way, and in a way that will grow far beyond our relatively limited fossil reserves. And that story, we've got to get that out there. It's going to be a lot easier when we have proof positive from a demonstration facility, not to say we aspire to do this, but rather it has been done and demonstrated.
Well, Dan, I think you've done a great job of sharing your value proposition with my audience and kind of really breaking it down, explaining it, but also painting some wider strokes of the larger industry, energy, and what it's going to take to actually make this a viable, at scale solution. Before I let you go, if people in my audience want to learn more about you and your work, where do people find you?
Well, first and foremost, you can check us out at syntholene.com. It's kind of a combination of synthetic and gasoline. So that's syntholene.com. And come find us on Twitter, Instagram. We've got a good YouTube going. You can find me personally on LinkedIn under my full name, Dan Sutton. Attached to Syntholene, there might be a couple other Dan Suttons out there, or also on Twitter. My handle's D Sutton. And don't be afraid to hit me up. I love to talk about fuel synthesis. I love to talk about Syntholene's plans. And we exist in this era where we're going to see synthetic fuels increasingly proliferate well within our lifetimes. This is a great story. It's a good story of cost competitiveness, of efficiencies, of reducing negative externalities. And perhaps it's a bit of a singular story in a clean energy environment that often has its own set of externalities. So we're really trying to cover those off and really look forward to engaging with your audience as they reach out.
Well said, Dan. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. To my audience, if you've enjoyed the show, make sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with somebody that needs to know about the future of e-fuels. Once again, thank you, Dan, for being here. And this is another episode of Blue Ocean Solutions Podcast. Take care, everyone.